November 15th, 2025, Japan's defenders brace for routine quiet over Yonaguni until a Chinese drone breaches the edge of Japan's sky. With jets scrambling and alarms triggered, what looks like a single incident explodes into a two-day standoff at sea. As warnings turn into military maneuvers, the crisis at Taiwan's doorstep suddenly comes home. But how close did this confrontation really get, and what warning signs did most people miss? Radar operators at Japan's Southwestern Command picked up the drone's signature just after sunrise. The object was moving in from the west, skirting the air corridor between Taiwan and Yonaguni. Within seconds, protocol took over. Duty officers relayed the track to Naha Air Base, home of the 204th and the 304th F-15J squadrons. Quick reaction. Alert Doctrine demands that fighters are airborne within 5 minutes of a scramble order. On this morning, the jets were rolling before the clock hit 6. Inside the cockpit, checklists are muscle memory. Former squadron leader Captain Saito describes the routine. He says, radar locks the target, we get the vector, and we're off the ground before we have time to think. As the F-15J jets close the distance, airborne warning and control aircraft, likely an E-2D Hawkeye, coordinated handovers and data link the drone's position in real time. The Interceptors leveled out at altitude, throttling back as they approach visual range. Standard procedure is to close to within 500 meters for unmanned targets, and never closer unless threat cues appear. Visual identification is everything. The lead pilot scans for markings, configuration, and payload. This time the drone was unmarked, flying a steady heading away from Yonaguni's airspace but well inside the Japanese ADIZ. The fighters broadcast challenge calls on the international emergency frequency, 121.5 MHz. No reply came back, as expected from an uncrewed system. The pilots logged the time, snapped gun camera stills, and maintained a parallel escort, careful not to provoke with aggressive maneuvering. Captain Saito explains, with drones, you keep your distance. They don't respond, and you never know if they're watching or just recording. Rules of engagement for drones are strict. Interceptors can shadow, warn, and document, but any escalation such as warning shots or forced landing requires direct ministerial approval. The priority is to avoid miscalculation. The F-15J jets held their station until the drone turned west, away from Yonaguni, and only then did they break off and return to base. Every step from scramble to withdrawal is logged and reviewed. The entire intercept, from radar detection to the drone's exit, unfolded in less than 30 minutes. It was a routine drill, but with every move watched by Tokyo and Beijing alike. At dawn on November 16th, Japanese patrol logs recorded 3 foreign vessels maneuvering inside the 12 nautical mile line around the Senkaku Islands. The ships flew Chinese Coast Guard colors, and their hull numbers were logged by the Japan Coast Guard. For hours, the vessels traced slow arcs near Kuba and Watsuri, ignoring repeated radio warnings broadcast on international VHF channels. This was not an isolated pass-through. Japan Coast Guard officers trained for these encounters followed protocol, 3 formal warnings, then shadowing at a measured distance. Each maneuver and bearing documented for the day's official report. Chief Cabinet Secretary Minoru Kihara confirmed the incursion at a press briefing that afternoon. The statement left no doubt. Chinese government ships had entered Japan's claimed territorial waters and remained there, undeterred. For much of the morning, in Tokyo, the government summoned the Chinese ambassador to lodge a formal protest. The language was precise, citing the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and referencing the 12 nautical mile territorial limit. At the same time, the Japan Coast Guard released position data and time-stamped photographs to the press, reinforcing the public record. For the crews aboard the Japanese patrol cutters, these standoffs are routine but never casual. Each encounter is a test of resolve and procedure. The Japan Coast Guard's operational doctrine calls for restraint, no ramming, no aggressive blocking, only shadowing and documentation. Every move is calculated, every radio exchange logged. The goal is to assert presence and reinforce Japan's claim, not to escalate. But the message is unmistakable. The Senkakus remain contested, and the gray zone pressure never lets up. On the ground in Yonaguni, port advisories went out to local fishermen, warning of increased patrol activity near the disputed waters. The island's council relayed requests requests for reassurance to Tokyo, while local news tracked the Coast Guard's maneuvers in real time. No evacuations were ordered, but the sense of unease was tangible. For residents and officials alike, the presence of foreign government ships so close to home was more than a headline. It was a reminder that maritime boundaries here are always under negotiation and that the Coast Guard's vigilance is the island's first line of defense. Japanese airspace is defined by more than lines on a map. The country claims a 12 nautical mile territorial sea around each of its islands, including Yonaguni and the disputed Senkakus. Entering this zone without permission is a direct violation of sovereignty under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, but the real legal boundary for most aerial encounters is the Air Defense Identification Zone, usually called the ADIZ, a buffer extending far beyond territorial airspace. Japan's ADIZ, declared in 1969, covers much of the East China Sea and requires all approaching aircraft to identify themselves, though it carries no standing in international law. As one University of Tokyo maritime law scholar explains, ADIZ is a safety measure, not sovereignty. Proximity alone does not prove legal violation. Japanese rules of engagement draw a sharp distinction between these boundaries. When an unidentified aircraft or drone enters the ADIZ, air defense units track, intercept, and challenge it by radio. Visual identification is mandatory, but action stops short of force unless the object crosses into the 12 nautical mile territorial limit or shows clear hostile intent. Even then, any escalation, like firing warning shots or attempting to force down a drone, requires direct authorization from the Minister of Defense. This ministerial threshold is designed to prevent accidental conflict, especially with unmanned systems where intent is hard to read. The same logic applies on the water. The Japan Coast Guard can shadow, warn, and document foreign ships inside the territorial sea, but cannot use force unless explicitly approved. Every maneuver, every radio call is logged for review. These legal frameworks are not just technicalities. They shape every decision made by pilots, officers, and local officials facing down foreign probes near Japan's frontline islands. On Yonaguni, the ordinary routines of island life are never far from the edge of uncertainty. The sea is both livelihood and boundary, and when fighter jets thunder overhead, the impact lands close to home. Local council representatives describe a community accustomed to drills and alerts, yet the reality of a live scramble for an unidentified drone just beyond the horizon brings a new kind of anxiety. One council member said, "We are used to drills, but to have real jets scrambled for a drone just over the horizon, it is a stark reminder the trouble is coming closer." Fishing boats waited at port longer than usual that weekend, with captains weighing the risk of heading toward the Senkaku grounds. Tourism inquiries dipped as news of the incident spread, and Beijing's travel warnings filtered through social media. The island's visitor center logged a handful of cancellations, but the real effect was harder to measure, a sense of vigilance settling over the community as residents watch the sky and sea for signs of the next approach. Officials on Yonaguni are trained to watch for 3 warning signs. The first is any repeat of drone or aircraft approaches near the island, especially those that trigger a military response. The second is the pattern of foreign Coast Guard ships lingering inside the 12 nautical mile zone, their presence tracked by both radar and word of mouth among local fishermen. The third is the tone of official statements from Beijing and Tokyo. When threats and warnings escalate in the media, islanders know the risk of miscalculation grows. These are the cues that shape daily life on Japan's westernmost frontier, where the line between routine and crisis is always thin. Today, the East China Sea is not just a line on a map, it is a flashpoint. With each incursion, the risk of miscalculation grows. The next move, by drone or by warship, could shape the balance of power in Asia. The world watches, and so do those who live on the edge.